Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to do a reading and kind of a close reading and exploration of William Blake's Proverbs of Hell. Um, I think I am going to make a regular practice of doing this because for the next month I'm in a 4 lecture long class on Blake, taught by Dr. Adam Walker over at Versed. And for this upcoming week is our first lecture, and Proverbs of Hell is one of the assigned poems. Although Proverbs of Hell is kind of more of like a collection of aphorisms. I have the William Blake complete illuminated books. I got it for Christmas. It's a huge tome, and it has every single um, plate that Blake made. So for those who don't know Blake, he wasn't just a poet, he was also an incredible visionary artist. And he would make these acid wash plates, um, where he would engrave his poems and create artworks in each work. So I have I think it's like 393 or something plates. So Proverbs of Hell is a little long. And so I think there's 4 plates total, 5. Um, so I think I'm gonna do one video per plate because it's really rich writing. I mean, just like the Proverbs in the Bible, it feels like you can meditate on a single line for quite some time and kind of never exhaust the meaning there. So I'm going to start with this first page. I'm going to read it and then I'm going to discuss it. All right. Proverbs of Hell. In seed time learn, in harvest teach, in winter enjoy. Drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. Prudence is a rich, ugly old maid, courted by incapacity. He who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. The cutworm forgives the plow. Dip him in the river who loves water. A fool sees not the same tree that a wise man sees. He whose face gives no light shall never become a star. Eternity is in love with the productions of time. The busy bee has no time for sorrow. The hours of folly are measured by the clock, but of wisdom no clock can measure. All wholesome food is caught without a net or a trap. Bring out, bring out number, weight, and measure in a year of death. No bird soars too high if he soars with his own wings. A dead body revenges, not injuries. The most sublime act is to set another before you. If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. Folly is the cloak of knavery. Shame is pride's cloak. So, yeah, there's a lot in here. Um, and maybe I'll kind of start with like a high level. God, there's so many places I want to go. But maybe I can just kind of start with like a high level themes and motifs that I see coming through. Um, so the line "the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom" is a oft quoted line from or just Blake in general, but especially in the Proverbs of Hell. And that notion of um, excess and desire leading to wisdom kind of is very counter to the the Christian morality of Blake's time in the 18th century, where repression, modesty, humility were the the foundations for all other virtues and for, for the Christian life. You think of the line, "The meek shall inherit the earth." Humble yourself before the Lord, things like that. This is, this is basically the opposite. This is like desire and, kind of that like eros, that like erotic desire is actually what leads to wisdom. Um, Prudence is a rich, ugly old maid courted by incapacity. Um, I think, he's kind of saying there, incapacity, um, and this kind of sense that prudence is almost like an imprisonment, like it kind of paralyzes you. It makes you um incapable of, kind of the actions and the kind of courageous movement um into more life. It's kind of like a disablement almost. Um and so there's this sense that action and um like movement in life, doing things is what ultimately allows someone to come into greater contact with God, with the divine, with wisdom ultimately. Um, and I think it's very similar to the notion that, like mentors give young adults a lot of times of like, you have to learn how to make your own mistakes. Like you actually have to you can't kind of skip that step and kind of um from a kind of detached seat of intellectualization and analysis become the sage. Like you have to slip and trip and fall in the mud and get up to become wise. And it's something that I've often thought about of like, um, I think one of the markers of freedom is the ability to make your own mistakes, the ability to have agency to actually make foolish decisions. Um, and then importantly, have people and have practices that can orient you from that and transform you, uh, and help you evolve. So that, the line, if the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. I don't think Blake is kind of making an equivocation between that and like the line, insanity is doing something over and over again, expecting a different result. I don't think he's just merely saying, well, if the fool just keeps doing the same foolish thing, he'll become wise. But th- the the fool can't become wise without undergoing, like, to transform. It's like you have to start somewhere and act and make mistakes and then course correct. That's the kind of turn towards wisdom. And I think in Blake's time, Christian morality was a lot about um, what to avoid. You know, we there's this whole laundry list of immoral actions. You can find all throughout the Bible. I'm reading Corinthians right now, like the sexual immorality that Paul was advocating against. There's there's this list of behaviors, thoughts, and attitudes that the Christian deems out of bounds. And much of much of the Christian life at that point was kind of like shepherding people to avoid, as opposed to maybe always um, what they are ultimately desiring. And I think Blake is trying to communicate that a life that is purely about what to avoid as opposed to what to move towards ends up kind of becoming its own version of hell. And that inaction breeds, he says, he who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. Um, and I actually had to look up. I've heard the word before, but it's, it's like one of those like words that isn't really used that much anymore. Um, yeah, so it's kind of like, like a disease. Um, it's kind of like a disease of the soul, a disease of the psyche. Um, there was someone who I was in a group call with recently who we had this exercise where we had to it was a relating exercise for like 3 or 4 minutes, and she kind of got cut off like right before she was going to have this big breakthrough, and she said she had intellectual blue balls. And I feel like that's kind of similar to someone who has desires but doesn't act on them. It's like this the desire, it kind of builds, it builds and builds and builds, but it doesn't actually have anywhere to be channeled to. And so it can either lead, that can either breed, um, so it's almost like it's like a virus. It kind of takes over you if it stays within oneself. It either bubbles over in anger and frustration over a lack of an actualized potential, or someone learns to kind of completely ignore it and dissolve it. But then in doing that, they effectively neuter themselves because they've kind of turned off their awareness to anything that resembles something that they want. And I think that's also something that Blake is trying to push back on, is the notion, I think the Christian notion, that desire is selfish, desire is satanic, desire is antithetical to God's will, because after all, if you're acting on your desire, um, you're interfering with God's will, right? With God's plan. Um, what's the thing that you hear over and over, getting raised in the church is like surrender to God. God is in control. Um, and I don't think Blake is arguing against that. Um, I think he very much still believes in that. Um, but I think he's trying to make people aware of the fact that there is such a thing as Christly desire. Um, the last line of this page is also just jumped right out at me, and I think it's really fascinating to meditate on, which is shame is pride's cloak. And so, what does that mean? Like, shame and pride feel complete opposites. Um, how is shame the cloak for pride? And if you think about shame and pride, they they're kind of seemingly opposites. Yes, in a sense. Shame is kind of the self-destructive belief that one is irredeemable, inferior, not enough. And every every action that they do in the world seems to produce negative consequences. Um, and that belief just kind of just eats at someone from the inside. And so it's a self-shrinking um, state, as opposed to pride is the opposite, is a self-aggrandizing, self-inflating sense that, you know, also comes from an insecurity around desire for control, attention, power, um, and still fundamentally a belief that one is insufficient and is actually quite small. And so I need to puff myself up to kind of compromise for that. But I'm kind of getting to where I want to get to, which is both shame and pride share a totalizing focus on the self. Um, and so, you know, I think it would be wrong to say that people who are shameful are actually prideful in disguise, because I think I would say that pride has more of a, well, in the kind of Blakean sense of like activity and action, I think it has more of an active quality to it, and can people who are very prideful can, I think, more easily fall into kind of the manipulative, like dark triad kind of personality. Um, but they both share the hyper obsessiveness over self. Um, People who are riddled with shame and people who are obsessively prideful are always thinking about themselves. One just has a completely on the face. I think both of them underneath have a very negative view of self. But on the face, shame has a very um, obsessively and irrationally negative perception of self, and pride the opposite. And so I think, you know, in the Christian, you know, in the unhealthy forms of Christianity where shame is used as a tool to bring about order and conformity, and you know, where ostracization and condemnation and excommunication are very real and present dangers. Um, shame is everywhere in the church. And I think what Blake is trying to say with that line is, you know, pride is one of the seven deadly sins, and um, you know, kind of one of the most feared, you know, uh, states to be in as a Christian. And he's trying to say, well, you're kind of you're enabling the same quality when shame is a driving force of the church. That you're actually not very far from pride. And so watch out. Um, and also, you know, everything that came before that in the page might seem to a traditionalist Christian to be prideful, right? Like acting on desire, um, you know, kind of viewing excess as a catalyst towards wisdom, you know, all of those things. Um, and I think that last line kind of serves to be Blake's kind of um, like main argument is, well, actually, like a religious culture that views the self as something like problematic and kind of inherently, like it's almost like a Hobbesian, Thomas Hobbesian view of the self, to kind of look at it as kind of like innately like egoic, selfish, um destructive, and it needs religion to kind of shape it and orient it towards, um, which, as I say that, like, there's one sense in which that's true, but how do you go about orienting one to God or to the divine? Do you do it through kind of like a forced servitude where, corporal punishment or like kind of frequent discipline is how you get someone there? Or do you do it through presenting one with potent, vivid experiences of beauty that open them up and that as John Vervaeke talks about, you're tempted by the good. And that's a form of desire, but it's not selfish. It's quite the opposite. It opens one up to a beatific vision of life that continuously draws them in, as opposed to um, a faith that is born out of fear of transgression and is kind of a forced um, adherence to moral law or something like that, which actually kind of shrinks someone. And maybe within that in group, they feel some sort of identity, or they feel some sense of connectedness. But once they encounter visions of the good life that differ from their own, how are they taught to meet that with judgment and with condemnation? And so there's an enclosure there. Um, so I think I'll stop there because I feel like if I go on to another page, um, this video could be really, really long. I hope that made some amount of sense. Again, this is I've read it now a few times, but the all the thoughts were just kind of stream of consciousness off the cuff. So, hope that made sense. I will probably listen to this back and maybe not agree with most of what I just said, but that's the fool persisting in his folly in hopes that he will become wise. So, all right, till next time.